Hey everyone, thanks for checking out the first LWT retrospective of 2017. If you haven't seen any of my previous retrospectives, I like to go through a console's library in order of release and point out which games I think are important or notable. Instead of waiting for more years to build up, I've decided to go through all of the current generation consoles for this year. So I'm starting off with the Nintendo Switch, and I plan to get through PS4 and Xbox One later. Usually I only go through the physical exclusives first. Later I'll go through digital stuff and multi-platform releases. But for the Switch I'm going to mention a couple multi-platform games because I know there are many Nintendo fans who don't check out other systems. The Nintendo Switch came out on March 3rd of 2017 this year. I mentioned some of the launch stuff in my launch day video, but I'm going to go through it all again so you don't have to check that out. The Switch had a strong year this year, a ton of great titles, amazing stuff. After a lot of the lackluster years that the Wii U had, it's amazing to see some of these real big heavy hitters come out on the Switch. Nintendo fans can really be proud of the console they have this year. One thing I'll note is everything is kind of overpriced. That's something I don't really want to get into with this video. A lot of these games you may consider not worth the cost or are more expensive than they are on other platforms. I just want to focus on the games themselves, so I'm not going to get into that from this point on. I just want to mention that because I do agree with that sentiment. Let's get into it with the first launch game, 1-2 Switch. 1-2 Switch was basically a tech demo party game for the Switch. It had 28 different competitive mini-games that used the unique features of the console. The games mostly take minor audio and visual cues from the Switch, so it's a really interesting game that uses the hardware but doesn't really feel like a video game. It was kind of a must-have at the time, just because there wasn't a whole lot of launch stuff and you really wanted to feel how all of that new Switch hardware worked, but in general it's not really a great game to play. Next up, the big launch title everyone wanted, the killer app, even though it was also released on the Wii U. I think this was the way to play it, and that is Zelda Breath of the Wild. Now, this was a whole new Zelda experience, one I didn't totally dig at first. I still don't agree with a lot of the 10 reviews, but it is an amazing game. It just doesn't really feel like a Zelda game. Now, granted, I'm not a huge Zelda fan, so the stuff that I was expecting, like the dungeons and the deep puzzle solving, weren't really in here. And maybe if you were a huge Zelda fan and played every game to completion, that was something you were tired of, and this was a breath of fresh air. For me, my first impression was this was a bit too different from previous Zelda games and a bit too much like Assassin's Creed and Far Cry and those kinds of open world games, which the market was already flooded with. But underneath that kind of upfront game design, there was some amazing stuff in here, and I've come around that this really is one of the best games of the year. It is an amazing Zelda experience. It really takes all those tropes from Zelda and just does a completely different and new thing with them. Regardless of if you care for dungeons or not, the way the game is designed I think is something that's really worth noting and something really special, because all of those other open world games which are designed similarly, they all have tons of bugs, they all fail in a bunch of different ways, and Zelda manages to create this open world that has just limitless possibility within the code, just tons of things that you can do that if the physics allow it, you can do it. It doesn't matter. The game doesn't set up these strict rules you have to follow. It's a sandbox game where you get to experiment however you want, and Nintendo really shows you what a AAA studio should be able to do with an open world game. It's not buggy, it's very fluid, and it's just a really fun experiment. It's a great Zelda game overall and had a ton of DLC launched afterwards just to keep you going, so I highly recommend it. It is a must-have for the Switch. It's a must-have for any gamer, really. The third launch game worth noting is Super Bomberman R. Now, this game was actually the only game that was kind of difficult to find at launch. I don't think they printed as much as the other games, but regardless, it was tough to get a physical copy, and because of that, I got a digital copy. And I'm quite happy with that digital copy because it's a great game to bring around and play with people. But that was before I started to really consider the space limitations of the Switch, so I'm being careful with what I get digitally now. That said, it's not an amazing Bomberman game, but it still is that kind of experience that you want to have with friends. The game features a 50-stage story mode that has 2-player co-op, so that's great to play with a buddy. It also features a traditional 8-player versus mode, and in November of 2017, an update was released that introduced the Grand Prix mode, which is a 3-on-3 battle mode where you either have to get the most kills or collect the most gems depending on your game modes. Overall, this is a fun game to have. At the time, it was a great game to have to play with multiple people. Granted, you have to have a ton of hardware to play with 8 players, but still a pretty good showpiece for the system. There were 2 other physical launch games on March 3rd. The first was Just Dance 2017. This is just notable because the Just Dance series is really big for Nintendo. Ubisoft puts it out on every platform, and even the latest version that came out, 18, was still available on both Wii and Wii U, so that's pretty crazy. The other launch game was Skylanders Imaginators, which was the latest Skylanders game and maybe the last. Looks like Activision has run this series into the ground like they have so many other great franchises, just putting out too many games, one every year, and just, a new 48 toys or however many come out with everyone, and just not a whole lot of innovation in the game. So this is notable just because it was a launch game, but if you're not a huge Skylanders fan, you can probably avoid it. One kind of personal pick, this came out much later in a physical version, but the digital version was released on launch day, and that is I Am Setsuna. This is one of the digital games published through the Square Enix Collective, which is a program that Square Enix runs where they kind of help promote and publish indie games. I think this was the first game to be published there, and it's kind of a love letter to games like Chrono Trigger, just fun 2D RPGs. It doesn't quite live up to that legacy, but it's a decent RPG. Now, the reason this one doesn't really belong here, but I'm throwing it in anyway, is that this is the worldwide Asia version. You can't get this game physically in North America. You have to import it. So if you're a collector who loves getting physical stuff, this is one that's worth getting. It's a little pricey. I think it's been on sale a couple times, so you might be able to get it on the cheap, but it's got full English on there and is a great way to have this game physically. Next up, this was supposed to be a launch title, but was pushed back. It is Puyo Puyo Tetris, so a combination of both Tetris and Puyo Puyo, and that just kind of feels right on a Nintendo system. Puyo Puyo was on a bunch of Sega systems, always renamed, so you may have never heard of it. It was games like Robotnik's Mean Bean Machine, and those kinds of puzzle games that play very differently to Tetris, and if you don't know what you're doing in Puyo Puyo, you will lose. It is not as simple as Tetris. You might be able to try and play it the same way, but once you go up against, but you'll lose pretty quickly because it is more about building giant combos and getting these huge chains together than it is just keeping the board clear. That said, it's great to have a version of Tetris on the go, kind of like the old Game Boy, and it's great to have a new version of Puyo Puyo to learn. You can play either game, or you can play this new mode that combines the two. This game is multi-platform, but it just feels right at home on the Switch. Next up is a game I'm ashamed not to have on this table. I do own it, I just couldn't find the box in time for this episode, and that is Mario Kart 8 Deluxe. This is a port of the Wii U game, and it includes all the DLC from that, including all of the other Nintendo characters like Link and Animal Crossing stuff. It is arguably the best Mario Kart to date. The update to HD really helps. All the controls have been redefined. It's a lot smoother experience. The new tracks are great and fun, and it really does use the online features of the Switch pretty well, so definitely a must-have if you have this system. Next up, a multi-platform game worth mentioning, Disgaea 5 Complete. So this is a port of the PlayStation 4 game. It includes all the DLC from that game, but nothing new. Basically, this is just cool because it is a strategy RPG that hasn't really been seen outside of PlayStation. There was a DS port of one that wasn't that great, but regardless, Disgaea is a great tactics series and one that Nintendo fans might not really know about. It's got a really deep tactics system. It's got fun comedic writing that you don't really see in a lot of games. And while you're waiting for a Fire Emblem game to come out on the Switch, this may be one worth checking out. Next up is a bit of an oddity, but a game that I couldn't resist, Ultra Street Fighter 2 The Final Challengers. Now this is a port of the remake of Street Fighter 2 that was released on PS3 and Xbox 360. It was only released digitally except on a kind of compilation disc for the 360, I believe, so it's great to have a physical release here. There's a couple new additions to the game, but they're kind of more interesting than they are good. First is two new characters, which are Evil Ryu and Violent Ken, so two new characters, although they're probably the least exciting new characters you could put in there. And there's also a new Way of the Hado mode, which is this weird first-person motion control Ryu game. It's more of another tech demo for the Switch, so again, it's just interesting to see, but not really fun to play. Next up is Nintendo's new fighting franchise, ARMS. It's a 3D fighter that supports up to 4-player matches. In the game, the players use their Joy-Con motion controls to control their punches and kicks in some really interesting ways. It plays very different from a traditional fighter. It's something more similar to like Virtual On with a cast of crazy characters and using the Joy-Cons instead of your traditional arcade joysticks. It works really well. It's a fun game. I don't know how much you'll get out of it, but the character designs are cool, the action is fun. It's just a really great first entry in this series. The game features 10 characters, and over the year 5 new DLC characters have been added, so they continue to support it quite a bit after launch. Next up is an indie game that's getting some great treatment, Cave Story Plus. Now, this one comes with a manual and little soundtrack CD, which is great for people like me who like a little more out of their physical editions. Cave Story Plus is the latest version of kind of this indie darling Metroidvania game that came out several years ago. The game is not the 3D remake that came out on the 3DS, but rather an updated version of the original 2D game. It adds a lot of stuff that was in the exclusive WiiWare version, so the new modes from that are in there, and you can switch back and forth between the original graphics and the WiiWare style graphics. The game features a completely updated script and a whole new area to explore. Next up, putting the online features of the Switch to use. I think the online features actually launched around this time, Splatoon 2. So, if you didn't get to play Splatoon on the Wii U, you were missing out. That was probably one of the top 5 must-play games on that console. It was a great new arena shooter, a really surprising and amazing thing from Nintendo. Just a new franchise that had an immense amount of style and substance to it, and there were some interesting design choices, love them or hate them, around the online gameplay, but overall just a really fun experience. So a new and fresh arena shooter experience. There was a little bit of a story mode, and this one just kind of ramps everything up a bit. It's not so different, but because so many people didn't play that original game, it's great to have something out there for the first year of Switch that people can get into. Next up is a game that was multi-platform, but I want to call it out because it's indicative of how the Switch is handling some indie titles, and that is Retro City Rampage DX. Now, this game has its fans, and they love it. It is a really cool kind of retro take on the top-down GTA formula, and it's a good sign that this was coming out to Switch in the physical format, although, I think it's already pretty tough to get, so if you're looking for it, I recommend, keep your eye out and picking it up pretty quickly. Right after that, we get Minecraft Story Mode, The Complete Adventures. Now, this is Telltale's Minecraft Story Mode, all 5 episodes on a cart, and that's what makes it interesting, is that all the episodes are on a cart. So unlike the Season Pass discs we get on other systems, the Switch is getting the full game physically. The next big game is something that was shown at E3 a couple months before its release, and something that I don't think people thought would be as good as it turned out to be, but that is Mario & Rabbids Kingdom Battle. Now, this is Ubisoft's take on a tactics game. It feels a lot like XCOM, which has done really well on other consoles, and it just really takes that tactics gameplay. It simplifies it to a level that anyone can enjoy, but also adds a whole bunch of new features that those original games don't have. Some really cool movement abilities to help your characters get around, and it's just a fun game and a really great use of both the Mario and Rabbids license. So if you don't know, this is a game where Mario and the Rabbids from the Rayman series come together, and characters from Mario team up with a couple Rabbids that are cosplaying Mario characters and go against these kind of evil Rabbids that have been controlled and are invading the Mushroom Kingdom. So it's got some really interesting game design where each world is set up as a series of battles with these little segments in between where you can explore and try and find new items and unlockables. If you're not into tactics games and something like Fire Emblem scares you, this is a game that I think anyone can get into and definitely worth checking out. Next up, another indie darling that is getting some physical love, that is Azure Striker Gunvolt the Striker Pack. So this includes the first 2 Gunvolt games. I think it would have been nice if they included Mighty Gunvolt in there, but I'll take what I can get. If you haven't played any of these games, they are really great, like kind of 16-bit Mega Man style clones. And we don't get enough of that. Capcom dropped the ball with Mega Man, Concept dropped the ball with Mighty No. 9, but if you're looking for that kind of great, Mega Man X1 style experience, these games are worth checking out. Immediately following that, another multi-platform game I'm going to mention, LEGO Worlds. Now this is pretty interesting because it's kind of built similarly to all the other LEGO franchise games, but this time there is no franchise associated with it. It is just kind of a weird mash of those LEGO games and a little bit of Minecraft-inspired gameplay there. So you explore these worlds, collecting a bunch of LEGO pieces, and then you can use those pieces to build new stuff. So a fun game that you can play both on and off TV. Right after that, Rayman Legends, the Definitive Edition, which I don't have on the table, and the reason is it's not really the Definitive Edition in my opinion. It's a shame because the Wii U version is the Definitive Edition. It is a great game, and it did some really interesting stuff with the touch controls that just didn't make it over here. So this version isn't really much better than any of the other console versions, not really worth upgrading to, but if you didn't get to check out that Wii U version, then it may be worth checking out. Next up, a fighter that was ported from the Wii U that I'm really glad it did because it did not get enough love there, and that is Pokken Tournament. Now, this game was supposed to be a weird mashup of Tekken and Pokemon, but it doesn't really play like Tekken. It plays much more like a 3D anime fighter, and it just plays really well, actually. It's a ton of fun and a great game to play with friends. It has 21 Pokemon to fight as and 16 pairs of support Pokemon who you can call in during battles to assist. The game added 5 new characters over the original Wii U release, and one of the new characters wasn't even released in Japanese arcades. Next up, another multi-platform game, but one I feel like is worth mentioning for anyone who didn't get to check it out on other consoles. That is Cinemore EX. Now, this is a horizontal 2D shoot 'em up that uses a unique time play mechanic. So instead of, having lives or hit points, you have a certain amount of time to beat a level, and that time goes down depending on how much damage you take, but you can get more time by defeating enemies. So a really unique gameplay system there for these kinds of games. Despite the look, it also has a pretty deep and mature storyline that really surprised a lot of people, so definitely worth checking it out if you're into shoot 'em ups. Next up, another multi-platform release, but one definitely that feels at home on the Switch, is AXIOM VERGE Multiverse Edition. Now, this was released physically in both a regular and special edition that came with a bunch of extras. I highly recommend you check it out on any console, even if it's just a download. This game is a love letter to Super Metroid. It looks and feels a lot like Super Metroid, but it doesn't just rip off that game. It has a bunch of unique and interesting gameplay mechanics that make it stand out and make it strong on its own. Next up is a really interesting game, which is Touhou Kabuto Burst Battle. Now, this is not a good game by any means, but it is a pretty notable title because the Touhou series has a big cult following, mostly amongst like otaku anime people. So if you've heard about the Touhou series and want to figure out what it's all about, this is probably an easy entry point. There's a ton of different genres in the Touhou universe. Mostly it's bullet hell shooters, but you can also get these one-on-one versus games or little RPGs. And this is a weird 3D one-on-one versus game, kind of like Virtual On. Like I said, not a great game, but it is one of the first to get a multi-platform release and be available on several different consoles for a fairly affordable price. So again, not a great game, but for hardcore Touhou fans, probably a must. Next up, following up on the success of Hyrule Warriors, we get Fire Emblem Warriors, and it is exactly what it sounds like. It is a Dynasty Warrior style game using Fire Emblem characters. So this one introduces some new mechanics to kind of tie into the strategy aspects of the Fire Emblem series, but overall it is just kind of a hack and slash fest. Now, it's got an interesting storyline. You can partner up with characters from previous Fire Emblem games, so definitely worth it for Fire Emblem fans. If you're not a huge fan of Dynasty Warrior games, I think Hyrule Warriors is the better game, but this is, still a pretty decent follow-up. Next up, the next heavy hitter for the console, and probably the only game to rival Breath of the Wild for popularity, that is Super Mario Odyssey. And it's been a long time since we've had a full-fledged 3D Super Mario game, and this one really does amazing things. It's a whole new different experience, still building on games like Mario 64, but it really just is a huge love letter to everything Mario. It's such a fun game. It's got a ton of nostalgia in there. It's a great mix of both balanced and difficult gameplay. Having so many power moons in every stage just really makes it feel like a lot more fluid than the other Mario games. You're going to see this one on a ton of Game of the Year lists, and it's well deserved. Really, I'm surprised Nintendo didn't hold it back for another year, but they're really coming out this year with all their heavy hitters, so it's great to see this out now. In a pretty silly move, in my opinion, following up on Super Mario Galaxy, just a couple weeks after, Sega puts out Sonic Forces. Now, Sega's riding high on that Sonic Mania love. Just a great 2D Sonic game that people have been hoping for a long time, and they kind of spoil all that goodwill with this game, which is kind of a shame because it had promise. It's a multi-platform game, but I know a lot of people who own Nintendo still love Sonic, so they may have picked it up. It's designed by the team who did great games like Sonic Generations and Sonic Colors, and was supposedly supposed to be a follow-up to those, so it seems like it kind of is. It has this 3 styles of gameplay. One is your classic 2D Sonic gameplay, one is your modern 3D Sonic gameplay, and one is this new kind of avatar gameplay that's supposed to play kind of like Sonic Heroes, where you build your own custom avatar and go through stages with modern Sonic and switch between the two to get through different kind of obstacles, but it just doesn't work that well. All around, I hear the game just isn't designed that great. It doesn't live up to even Sonic Generations, which is a shame, but for hardcore Sonic fans, it is probably something you checked out. Going into another multi-platform game right after that, but one that I think Nintendo fans who only play Nintendo games should definitely check out, and that is Doom. Now, Doom is a game that broke down the FPS genre back to its roots and just said, let's make wide open areas, let's make crazy, fast, fun gameplay, and this game feels like what a modern Doom should feel like. It is wicked fun. The single player is crazy fun. The multiplayer is not that great, but you're really here for the single player experience, which says a lot about an FPS. So highly recommended if you only have a Switch. Definitely check this out. If you have other systems, it's better on those, but it's great that Nintendo fans can experience this game too. Following that, we get Snipper Clippers Plus. Now, this is a physical release of Snipper Clippers, which came out digitally on launch day, but it also includes the DLC pack for that game. Now, Snipper Clippers, if you didn't play it before, is this really interesting game where you, either together with another player or alone, control these shapes and have to kind of use these shapes to make shapes or cut out shapes of the environment and kind of match these puzzles. It's a pretty fun game. I think it's a bit overhyped, but it's still worth checking out. The Plus DLC adds 30 new levels, 2 new modes, and I think even these new shapes. Next up is Batman the Telltale series, which again I'm only mentioning because it is the complete series on a physical cart. Following that, we get It'll Do 2 Plus, which is a multi-platform digital game, but I think this may be the only physical version, and it's fitting that it's on the Switch because the original It'll Do was a Wii U download game. If you haven't heard of it, this game is a take on the 2D Zelda formula. In this one, you explore a new island with a bunch of dungeons. You have 4 upgradable weapons, which also act as tools to solve puzzles throughout the game, and the Switch version features an exclusive Dream World scenario with 5 new dungeons. So if you're hankering for some classic 2D Zelda action, this is a game worth checking out. Next up is Elder Scrolls V Skyrim, which I'm just calling out because it was released on the Switch. This is a great game if you've never played it. I'm not going to give it total love because I'm going to fault Bethesda for not fixing any of the issues with the game. These games are notoriously buggy. They're amazing open world games that are worth checking out, but they just frustrate me how they don't care about fixing bugs. And on a system like the Switch, which you can't patch the game with fan-made mods that fix those issues, it's a shame. Following that is a game called Super Beat Sonic, which it got a physical release on the Switch. This game was also released on the PS4 and PS Vita, and the Vita is still the best version, sadly, because it features touchscreen controls. The game was designed by the makers of DJ Max, which was a big PSP series, and this was kind of their follow-up to that, and it really relies on touchscreen controls to play well. Now, the Switch version does have touchscreen controls, but apparently the launch version, they just didn't work well. They were really off, and the publisher did say that they were going to release a patch and fix that. They may have, but it's a shame that that wasn't right for launch. Next up, a game I would have triple dipped on, except that they managed to screw it up with the cartridge size limitations. That is Resident Evil Revelations Collection. So the physical release, not really a collection since you only get one of the games on there. Only Resident Evil Revelations 1 is on there. 2, you just get a download code for. So, given the fact that I want my games physically and that I have so little space to waste on something like that, I didn't pick it up. But if you haven't played Resident Evil Revelations and like Resident Evil or are interested in it, they are both great Resident Evil games. They're actually at a time when the series was on a decline with Resident Evil 6, Revelations came out and just reminded everyone of what a great survival horror experience could be, and 2 was a great episodic follow-up to that. I highly recommend both of them. Next up, the last game I have on the table, but definitely one worth talking about, Xenoblade Chronicles 2. Now, this is a follow-up to Xenoblade Chronicles, which was on the Wii. It is a direct sequel, but not really because it is a whole new world and a whole new cast of characters. It just doesn't really follow up on Xenoblade Chronicles X for the Wii U. If you haven't played any Xenoblade Chronicle games, they are these big, sprawling RPGs which use MMO-style combat and mission structure. So you explore these big open areas, you set your auto attack, and then you choose what skills to follow up with. You have a party of characters that come along with you that are mostly AI controlled, but I think I'm underselling it. It is an amazing game. It's a good mix of a streamlined RPG experience and a bunch of in-depth gameplay that's great for both people who aren't too familiar with RPGs and hardcore RPG players. If you played both of the previous Xenoblade games, it is much more like the first game in its design. The structure is focused a lot more on story, so that's something I prefer, so I'm glad they went back to that. And the game features this new blade gameplay. So your character gains control of a blade, which is a weaponized life form that he can use to fight with. So there's some interesting new gameplay mechanics to that, and that ties into the story, which is all about these blades. The last physical notable game released, in my opinion, was The End Is Nigh. So this is kind of a spiritual successor to Super Meat Boy, and is by one of the creators of that game. Gameplay and style are very similar to Super Meat Boy, with fast-paced and tough platforming. The game apparently has much more of a focus on exploration as well, though, so that's a welcome addition to just those tough platforming challenges. So that's it for my 2017 Nintendo Switch retrospective. Thanks for checking it out. There's a ton of games here that I think aren't going to make it on a bunch of top 10 lists, so definitely check them out. Show them some love if you can. There's a lot of interesting stuff. I've got a bunch of other retrospectives planned coming up. I'm going to do the other consoles and get to multi-platform and digital stuff. 3DS is definitely going to get done soon. So stay tuned for all that stuff, and I'll see you next time. Thanks.